Hi and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. The woman I spent 2 years caring for died on a Tuesday afternoon on a rain-slicked stretch of highway. The woman who looked just like her, a stranger with my wife's eyes, was born in the sterile, quiet room of a hospital a few hours later. It all started with a phone call, the kind that cleaves your life into a before and an after. I was at work, staring at a spreadsheet, when the unfamiliar number flashed on my screen. A paramedic's calm, professional voice informed me that my wife had been in a single-car accident. He used words like non-life-threatening and precautionary, but all I heard was a roar of static in my ears. The drive to the hospital was a blur of panic and prayer. I pictured the worst, my mind a slideshow of horrific possibilities. When I finally burst into her room, the relief was so profound it made me weak in the knees. She was sitting up in bed, looking dazed and small in the oversized gown, but she was alive. There was a bandage on her forehead, a few bruises, but she was whole. I rushed to her side, my heart overflowing with a love sharpened by terror. I took her hand and said her name. She looked at me, her eyes, the same warm, familiar eyes I had looked into 1,000 times, were completely, utterly blank. She tilted her head with a polite, distant curiosity, the way one might look at a stranger who has mistaken them for someone else. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a soft, unfamiliar whisper. "Do I know you?" That was the moment the real accident happened. The doctors called it global retrograde amnesia. The impact, they explained, had caused a trauma to her brain that had effectively wiped the slate clean. She had no memory of her past, of our life, of me. They said it could be temporary, that the memories might return in flashes or floods, or they might not return at all. They sent us home with a stack of pamphlets and a list of specialists, but they couldn't give me back my wife. The first few weeks were a surreal nightmare. I was living with a ghost. She was physically present, but the person I had married, the woman who knew my every secret and finished my sentences, was gone. I became her custodian, her historian. I showed her our wedding album, and she looked at the smiling woman in the white dress with a detached fascination, as if studying a character in a novel. I played our favorite songs, took her to our favorite restaurants, but nothing sparked a flicker of recognition. She was polite, compliant, and deeply, terrifyingly absent. In the face of this impossible reality, I made a vow. I would not abandon her. I would dedicate myself completely to her recovery. I would be so patient, so loving, so steadfast, that I would make her fall in love with me all over again. I saw it as the ultimate test of my love, a sacred duty. I believed that the bond we shared was stronger than a physical injury, that our love was a thing of the soul, and I would find a way to reconnect us. To do this, I had to completely dismantle my own life. I took an extended leave of absence from my job, which eventually became a resignation. I couldn't leave her alone. She was like a child in a world she didn't understand. I became her full-time caregiver. My days were a grueling routine of gentle reminders, doctor's appointments, and a suffocating, one-sided nostalgia. I managed her medication, I cooked her meals, I walked her through the simple architecture of a life she no longer recognized. Our savings, which had always been modest, began to evaporate. The specialist appointments weren't cheap. The loss of my income was a catastrophic blow. But I told myself that money didn't matter, only she mattered. The loneliness was the hardest part. I was mourning a wife who was still there. I would talk to her for hours, telling her stories of our life together, of the day we met, of our first trip, hoping to find a loose thread, a single memory I could pull on to unravel the knot in her mind. She would listen patiently, her head tilted, but her eyes remained empty. I was talking to a wall. At night, I would lie next to her in bed, the space between us feeling like a vast, icy chasm. She was a stranger who slept in my wife's place. The sacrifice was absolute. My friends would call, inviting me out, but I always declined. My world had shrunk to the four walls of our house. My entire being was focused on this single, all-consuming task. I was going to bring her back. Slowly, I started to see what I thought were flickers of progress. A small, genuine smile when I made her favorite breakfast. A moment when she seemed to relax in my presence. I clung to these tiny moments like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. They were proof that my efforts were not in vain, that the woman I loved was still in there somewhere, fighting her way back to me. 2 years passed like this. 2 years of my life gone. Our savings were a distant memory. I had maxed out our credit cards and taken out a high-interest personal loan just to keep us afloat. The financial pressure was a constant, crushing weight. The house was in foreclosure. I was at the end of my rope, a man running on the fumes of a love that was now just a memory. I had failed. She hadn't gotten better, and in the process of trying to save her, I had destroyed myself. The discovery that unraveled it all happened on a bleak Saturday morning. I was in the garage, sorting through old belongings, looking for anything of value I could sell online to make the next mortgage payment. In the back of a dusty closet behind a stack of old paint cans, I found a small, locked metal box I didn't recognize. I assumed it was something of hers from before I met her. Curiosity got the better of me. I found a crowbar and pried it open. Inside, my world ended for the second time. The box was a Pandora's jar of a life I never knew she had. There were bank statements from an account I didn't know existed, showing a pattern of large, regular cash withdrawals from casinos in a neighboring state. There were stacks of threatening letters from loan sharks, the language violent and explicit, demanding repayment of tens of thousands of dollars. The dates on the most recent letters were from the weeks leading up to the accident. My blood ran cold, but the worst was at the bottom, tucked inside a cheap envelope. It was a spiral notebook, a diary of sorts, and it was in her handwriting. I read the first page and the air left my lungs. The diary was not a chronicle of a life. It was the blueprint for a lie. She wrote about her gambling addiction, a secret she had hidden from me for years, about the escalating debts, the terror, the feeling of being trapped. And then she wrote about her solution, the amnesia. The car accident was real. A minor fender bender she had intentionally caused by slamming on her brakes on a wet road. But the memory loss was a complete, calculated fabrication. She had spent months researching amnesia online, studying symptoms, rehearsing her performance. It was a desperate, sociopathic masterpiece of a plan to escape her debts, to make the loan sharks believe she was a vegetable who couldn't pay, and to use me, my love, my devotion, my entire life, as her human shield. She wrote about the guilt she felt, but she justified it as her only means of survival. "He's a good man," she wrote in one entry. "He'll take care of me, it's better this way. He'll never have to know how badly I failed." The last 2 years of my life, my sacrifice, my grief, my unwavering love, it was all a sham. I had not been caring for a victim. I had been held captive by a performer. I closed the box, my hand steady, my heart a frozen, dead thing in my chest. The all-consuming love I had felt was gone, replaced by a clarity that was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. I didn't confront her right away. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-aware detachment. I watched her, but I was seeing her for the first time. I saw the subtle, masterful tells of her performance, the slight hesitation before answering a question, as if searching a blank memory bank, the carefully calibrated look of confusion when I mentioned a name from our past, the way she avoided looking me directly in the eye for too long. She wasn't a broken woman. She was a brilliant actress giving the performance of a lifetime. The grief I had carried for 2 years curdled into a silent, white-hot rage. She hadn't just lied to me. She had stolen 2 years of my life. She had let me bankrupt myself, emotionally and financially, to maintain her fiction. She had watched me mourn for her while she was standing right in front of me. The confrontation was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no accusations. The next morning I walked into the kitchen as she was drinking her coffee, looking out the window with her practiced, vacant stare. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the open metal box on the table in front of her. I laid out the bank statements, the threatening letters, and finally the spiral notebook, opened to the first page. I watched her face. For a moment she maintained the mask, her eyes wide with feigned confusion. Then her gaze fell upon the notebook, upon her own handwriting, and the mask shattered. It was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, crumbling decay. The blankness in her eyes was replaced by something I hadn't seen in 2 years, raw, unfiltered panic. The stranger was gone. My wife, the liar, the architect of my ruin, was finally back in the room. She tried to speak, to stammer out a justification, but the words died in her throat. The lie was too vast, too complete. There was no way to talk her way out of it. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want an explanation. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted it to be over. I turned around, walked into our bedroom, and packed a single bag. I took my wallet, my keys, and the few things that were truly mine. 10 minutes later, I walked back into the kitchen. She was still sitting at the table, staring at the evidence of her betrayal, tears streaming down her face. They were the first real tears I had seen from her in 2 years. They meant nothing to me. "The performance is over," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The house is in foreclosure. The creditors are your problem now." I placed my house key on the table next to the notebook. I didn't look at her again. I walked out the front door and didn't look back. I walked away from the house, from the debt, from the last 2 years of my life, and from the woman who had thought so little of me that she had turned my love into her prison. The freedom was terrifying, but it was real. Thank you for tuning in to Reddit Whispers. We've all faced moments when everything felt broken. What was your turning point? Leave it in the comments, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now.